Foreign Policy, 31st of May 2023, China wishes for the world to stop being concerned about its hegemony in Asia. To ostensibly stop China from assuming a hegemonic role in the Indo-Pacific, the United States and its Asian allies seek to maintain a balance of power there. They are concerned that Beijing will gradually persuade its neighbors to turn away from the United States, recognize Chinese dominance, and submit to Beijing's views on crucial foreign policy matters. For instance, the former Defense Secretary of the United States, James Mattis, cautioned in 2018 that China hoards long-term intentions to rewrite the existing global order. Their model appears to be the Ming Dynasty, albeit in a more aggressive way, which demanded that other countries become tribute states and bow down to Beijing. Similar arguments have been made by prominent realists writing on U.S. grand strategy, including myself, Rush Doshi, Elbridge Colby, and other former U.S. officials. China's stated desire to be a leading global power and its efforts to change the status quo in the South China Sea and other areas appear to justify these concerns. This viewpoint's consequences are problematic. Direct conflict between the two most powerful nations in the world will be brutal to avoid if China is actively attempting to establish itself as the region's hegemon in Asia and the United States is dead intent on preventing it. But are these worries valid? Although China may benefit more if it could drive the United States out of Asia and establish itself as a true regional hegemon, that objective is likely out of reach. Chinese attempts to establish regional hegemony are likely to fail and do great harm to China, and others. Therefore, even though it cannot rule out this possibility, the United States can approach it optimistically. Thus, the United States and its allies must take care that their efforts do not persuade China's leaders that they must attempt to achieve hegemony despite the apparent hazards, even as they work to maintain a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Why regional hegemony is desirable, but China cannot achieve it. It is simple to comprehend why a strong state could desire to be the lone considerable power in its region or a regional hegemon. A regional hegemon has little need to worry about direct attacks on its native territory if no other big powers are nearby. A great power that exerts this kind of dominance over its surroundings will also be less susceptible to blockades or other types of pressure, and even if it does not directly rule over the smaller states in its sphere of influence, it can nonetheless expect deference from them. A regional hegemon may more easily extend power into other regions if doing so seems essential or desirable while local threats are absent. The history of the United States well shows these advantages. Two large seas divide the United States from the other big countries, shielding it from many conflicts. This free security afforded American leaders a great deal of discretion. They could choose to wage wars of choice abroad if it made sense to do so or remain neutral when conflicts broke out elsewhere. The United States could eventually withdraw without placing its security in danger when these far-off initiatives failed, as they did in Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan. China's authorities believe achieving hegemonic status in the Indo-Pacific would increase their nation's security. If the U.S. did not have solid military forces deployed across the region and were not tightly allied with several of Beijing's neighbors, Beijing would have less to worry about. Given the constrained maritime topography of East and Southeast Asia and Beijing's heavy reliance on international trade, China would be less susceptible to blockades in a conflict. It would also be more straightforward for Beijing to project influence elsewhere if it wanted to do so with fewer local threats to be concerned about. The United States wants to avoid this circumstance, which is likewise explained by the same factors. The United States has worked to maintain a general balance of power in Europe and East Asia since it rose to great power status at the turn of the 20th century and to prevent any one state from dominating either region. Leaders in the United States were worried that an Asian or European hegemon might one day surpass them in terms of economic and military capability. It could decide to intervene in other regions, as the United States has been able to do, no longer worried about regional threats. Such a competitor may even form alliances with nations in the Western Hemisphere, forcing Washington to concentrate its efforts locally. The United States eventually entered both world wars. It maintained sizable military forces in both regions throughout the protracted Cold War out of a persistent determination to avoid a regional hegemon in Europe or Asia. But are these worries valid? Although China may benefit more if it could drive the United States out of Asia and establish itself as a true regional hegemon, that objective is likely out of reach. Chinese attempts to establish regional hegemony are likely to fail and harm China, and others. Why regional hegemony is, almost, unattainable. Although theoretically ideal, regional hegemony has historically proven to be a difficult objective to achieve. According to Jonathan Kirshner, all but one of the great powers' attempts to establish control in a particular region in the modern era failed. Louis XIV and Napoleon Bonaparte's France failed, Germany was soundly defeated in both world wars, and Japan's attempt to construct a hegemonic order in Asia was a complete failure. The only significant power in its region to succeed in doing so was the United States. In short, less than 20% of people succeed in the modern world. The failures were also complete disasters for the nations that attempted them, not minor setbacks. The Napoleonic Wars claimed the lives of perhaps 1 million Frenchmen, and Bonaparte passed away in exile on a little island in the South Atlantic. In 2 world wars, Germany suffered greatly and was split into several states for more than 40 years. During World War II, Japan was firebombed, atomic bombs destroyed 2 towns, and a foreign occupation changed the country's democratic system. While attempting to achieve regional hegemony may be desirable, doing so almost always makes a state less secure. Hegemonic attempts fall short for 2 key reasons. First, there is a strong inclination for large countries to balance against threats, as defensive realists have long highlighted. Nearby states generally work together to dissuade or defeat powerful forms when they are close by, when their armed forces appear to be designed to project power against others, and when they appear to have revisionist ambitions. The effectiveness of balancing conduct increases if a potential hegemon declares war to further its objectives. Nationalism is the second obstacle to regional hegemony. Local populations will make tremendous sacrifices to repel invaders, as Napoleon found when he invaded Spain, as the Soviet Union and the United States learned in Afghanistan, and as Moscow is again being reminded in Ukraine. Even momentarily defeated nations frequently stay uneasy and want to overthrow an aspirant hegemon's yoke. The collapse of the European colonial empires in the 20th century is another example of how nationalist ideologies have bolstered resistance to foreign hegemony. The lone exception to this repeated pattern is the United States, the only regional hegemon in the contemporary age. The United States was an ocean removed from the other great powers and able to expand over North America without engaging in conflict with another significant power or defeating a balancing coalition. Other would-be hegemons, however, faced coordinated opposition from authoritarian and well-organized nation-states. Native Americans tried to resist but were weakened by their vulnerability to European illnesses and fragmented into numerous loosely organized tribes and nations. Although Native American resistance to American expansion remained until the late 19th century, the native tribes eventually became overwhelmed by an unstoppable demographic tide due to unsolvable challenges with collective action and a declining population. Simply speaking, the United States was fortunate. Could China currently become the regional hegemon? There are no longer the same circumstances in Asia that permitted the United States to rule the Western Hemisphere and shut out other significant nations. Even though China may be stronger than all of its neighbors combined, a number of them are still significant industrial powers with the ability to curtail Chinese strength significantly, and the United States, the other considerable force in the globe, is still committed to assisting in their defense. India's population is currently younger and more prominent than China's, and its economy is expanding faster. The defense budgets of many of China's neighbors are substantially increasing, and Australia, India, and Japan are coordinating with one another in the United States. These responses will be more forceful the more afraid they are of Chinese control. Additionally, Japan or South Korea might obtain a nuclear deterrent if necessary, and India already has a nuclear arsenal. Tokyo and Seoul officials have previously stated that they believe this to be an option should the need arise. Having their deterrent would further restrict China's capacity to scare them. Therefore, China should curtail its goals and prevent such a move if it does not want more of its neighbors to acquire nuclear weapons. Asian leaders are unlikely to be persuaded by Chinese President Xi Jinping's assertion that it is for the people of Asia to run the affairs of Asia, solve the problems of Asia, and uphold the security of Asia. Such claims undoubtedly aim to diminish the legitimacy of the US's role in Asia. Still, they ignore the power of contemporary nationalism, which did not exist when the pre-modern, Sino-centric tributary system was in place, and assume that a shared Asian identity will prevail over each state's self-interest. China, of course, but also India, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and Vietnam are all countries where nationalism is a potent force. It isn't easy to envisage these governments choosing national autonomy over submission to Beijing. Lastly, contemporary communications and surveillance technology make it much simpler for states to recognize hazardous actors and plan defensive actions. States threatened by a Chinese endeavor to dominate Asia may communicate their worries, pool their resources, and quickly develop a coordinated response. As demonstrated by the speedy and forceful Western response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, nations facing a shared threat may sometimes move surprisingly quickly. What happens if regional hegemony is not an option? What do the US and China have to fight about if China's chances of regional hegemony are slim? Each is a sizable nation with hundreds of millions of devoted citizens. They have conventional solid military forces, second-strike nuclear capabilities, and vast, developed economies that no foreign power could effectively stifle. They are divided by a vast ocean, making it impossible for either side to invade the other successfully. Coexistence is not only preferred but also inevitable. China's leaders may still elect to take the same dangerous route as past would-be hegemons. The risks of a hegemonic bid, however ill-advised, would increase if they believed the regional balance of power was heavily in their favor, that nearby states could be intimidated into neutrality, that one or two victories would make further resistance impossible, and that other states in Asia would eventually regard Chinese primacy as legitimate. In the worst case, Chinese officials can delude themselves into believing that the odds favor their attempt to acquire regional hegemony while simultaneously fearing that the tide of power may decisively shift against them if the chance is not taken. This recipe for preventive war is a mix of wishful thinking and paranoia, and it was this logic that led leaders of Germany and Japan to want to establish hegemony in the early half of the 20th century. What this means for the US and its allies in Asia is obvious. On the one hand, they should strive to reduce the numerous elements that can obstruct good balancing and may mislead Beijing into believing that an attempted hegemony may succeed. The United States and its allies must, however, make it quite clear that they are not attempting to jeopardize China's sovereignty or territorial integrity, undermine the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, or wreck the country's economy. To prevent China's leaders from concluding that they must pursue hegemony even though the chances of success are slim, reassurance is required. Messaging consistency will be crucial. Although recent remarks by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan were meant to reassure Beijing about the scope and purpose of American export controls and other economic measures, efforts to give NATO a strategic role in Asia and the more aggressive closing statement made after the G7 summit meeting earlier this month send a different signal that cannot help but increase tensions. Over the previous 3 centuries, a significant power has concluded that establishing a dominant position over its neighbors was necessary for maintaining its security on several occasions. All but one of these attempts ended in total failure. China would be foolish to do it, but the United States and its allies would also be laughable if its actions unintentionally led Beijing to believe that making a risky attempt at hegemony was still its best course of action.